Thank you so much for joining everybody, All Things Global, powered by Vistatec. This is episode 4. Thank you for joining today. Interesting topic on machine translation and artificial intelligence with the founder and CEO, Konstantin Savenkov. I hope I said that correctly, Konstantin. Konstantin has a very interesting background, as well as some time with other types of companies, and that has evolved to him founding and evolving to being a founder and CEO of Intento. So without further ado, we'll get started. This is a live webcast, so just some housekeeping items. You'll all be live and able to ask questions of Konstantin once we talk a little bit about his background and you know, what he's accomplished. So without further ado, Konstantin, thank you so much for joining All Things Global, powered by Vistatec today. Can you tell us a little bit, which I find just fascinating, going from, you know, your background at Moscow State to doing helping out at startups with Bookmate and Mendoho. Tell us a little bit about your journey, if you don't mind, and how you've gotten to where you are today with Intento.
Oh, yeah, sure. Thanks for inviting me. Well, you know, I spent some time at university. I was teaching and making my PhD, and then I left to write recommender systems. But I think for books and for music. But I think the most exciting was not that it was about recommender systems. It was about we built a couple of startups which seriously disrupted content publishing market for music and for books. With, you know, switch from buying files and CDs to listening music through streaming. Like we launched our music streaming alongside Spotify, but in Eastern Europe and CIS. And then we did the same for books. And the most exciting was to see how new technology goes through different stages of adoption, disrupting massive fragmented market with long supply chains, which I guess sounds really similar to localization market, right? So, and that I think what was similar. So, then with my partner, we decided to launch Intento. It was, I think, early 2016, and our main idea was to help companies work with AI in general, because we found that large enterprises fail a lot when they are trying to use artificial intelligence, and that those failures are not because AI is not there yet, you know, as I say. It's not because the model is not accurate, it's because just people approach working with AI solutions in a wrong way. They're thinking it's the same software which they're procuring through Excel spreadsheets for the last 30 years. And then you can do the same, just find some vendor, have a pilot, and scale it up, and it will be a success. But it turns out that it's more like it may lead to dead end. And then when we looked at, okay, where we had the most of these problems, we found that actually translation and localization is one of the most important fields for that. Because on one hand, it's everyone's problem. Every large company in almost every department, they need translation and machine translation. Even if they don't know about that, they need it, that's for sure. And then actually translation, as I'm sure you know, it's people trying to work with machine translation since probably 1950. So among all AI, sort of AI, although it's quite a modern term, I think machine translation is one of the oldest places where people are trying to work in the loop alongside these technologies. And so it's just in this field, it's relatively convenient to help people work with AI and help people be more productive with AI. For other fields, for example, desktop publishing or anything related to speech and video, it's much less tools, and it will be in the future. But translation is, yeah. So we built Intento, and we found that it's really the problem, and we spent a couple of years looking for the right solution. It looks like we found it, at least, and the solution is in that. If you put enough effort into combining right models and then doing proper automated post-editing to make them more suitable for a specific use case, you're able to get this one set of models and then use it across the whole enterprise, not only localization department, but just touch day-to-day lives of almost every employee in the company and make them more productive. Working with multilingual content.
So you kind of found a place that had a need, and it definitely was in the localization space. So very interesting. So without further ado, Laura, do you want to take over the questioning? I think maybe you had the first question as a kickoff.
Oh, yes, indeed. Thank you. Thank you, Konstantin. So, but I have a couple questions. One is, I want to marvel. So you looked into streaming music and publishing beforehand, before you went into translation?
Yeah, that's true. I was an early employee in a couple of startups in this field.
Very cool.
Yeah,
and then of all the industries, you chose translation as the next place to to help kind of maximize the benefits of AI, huh?
Yep.
Wow. Okay, great. That's very cool. Well, okay, so along those lines, what are you seeing right now when you look at localization, and maybe what you saw when you first started looking at it and what you're seeing now about the trajectory for deploying AI and MT in localization? Where do you think we are in the trajectory?
Well, again, it feels, for me, from business standpoint, it feels really similar to markets related, working with content. Mm-hmm. We thought it's different, but it turned out that actually you have a very complex ecosystem. We learned with technology vendors, AI vendors, data owners, service providers, software vendors, and it's very complex. And we found that, in that sense, which became clear that when you apply new technology to existing large market, then it goes through certain stages of adoption. So first, you need to show that, okay, new technology can deliver as good results as the old technology, as the old way of solving problems. Mm-hmm. So that in this case, it's about that you can build such models so that after editing with less time, you could get the same quality. So then you have, after you've shown that, then you have user experience challenge, meaning that translators need to learn with, how to work with machine translation, and end users have to learn how to work with machine translation. Mm-hmm. And after that, it was one of our, I would say, most recent discoveries when we started to have large enterprise customers, and when we started to build really good solutions for them, so that end users are just happy. We reported like 97% end user acceptance for machine translations. It's almost perfect. Still, for localization space, you cannot get ROI right away because you have those existing supply chain and contracts, and your suppliers have their own suppliers, and so on and so on and so on. And I talked to Jochen Hummel recently, and we discussed that what's happening now with machine translation is a little bit similar to what happened when translation memories were invented. When the idea is quite simple. and it's relatively simple to implement, but the adoption requires the whole market just to turn over, to pivot from the way they were doing things to a new way. And that's what's happening.
Yeah.
So that's what I see also I think the most challenging here, because the business models will change, that's clear. Just technically, if you look at this long supply chain, it's also value creation chain, right? Every step adds value. So if you just bring something to end user, which creates lots of value, then the question how this value will be redistributed in the supply chain, and that should happen, and it will happen. And it's already sort of past tipping point. That's the tipping point when the quality is there, end users ready to use it, translators know how to post edit. So it's already happened, and now the business should catch up. Otherwise, it will happen without business, with new business.
I see many people who have a different role in the whole process are kind of evolving and adopting different tools in order to incorporate the machine in their daily work. So I have this perfect example. My colleague Paula on the screen here was a translator, and then as an early adopter of, okay, how does the machine think? Okay, let me translate knowing how the machine thinks. And then now she's gone a different level where she's helping others to figure out how the machine thinks and deploy the machines. So every translator will take that process, I think, and everybody else who is involved in the process at different, like you said, the different values that they provide will adopt. That's cool.
And you know, if I may, because I have another example, which is sort of, you probably wouldn't say it's about localization, but it's quite interesting that in global customer service, the old way of solving this problem is to just hire lots of native speakers in different time zones. And sometimes it's super challenging and expensive because you need to provide 24/7 and in all languages. So you have to have, people in Asia speaking all European languages. And it turns out that when you bring in technology, you can move your native support agents to curate machine translation so that the support itself, support services rendered by English-speaking people, but when they report problems with translations, your native speakers review those reports and they improve machine translation models. So they actually turn from being support engines to being more closer to people involved in localization. They help to train the technology, and it turns out it's more interesting, and it's more, I would say, it's more important in this case, because those are unique people. They know business problems, they know language, so you can use them in the most efficient way in this case.
Very cool for the language industry, for sure, to be closer. That's great. So I want to say hello to all the people who are on the screen, and I encourage anyone who'd like to come on the screen and ask a question. So I'll coordinate this. So we learned in episode 1 of All Things Global how to use our hands. So if you guys can't hear anything, feel free to give us a little saying sign. And if you'd like to say something, feel free to say something. So
and let me the hand gesture, Laura, on the thing. Nicole has her hand up.
Great, perfect. So I'm going to start with Nicole, and then I'll kind of help you guys ask some questions. What's your question, Nicole, for Konstantin? Oh, but you're on mute.
I'm getting there. It's not so soon. So thanks, guys. Konstantin, I'm wondering if, it's very expensive to really train up an engine, and I'm wondering if there's any value to, ideally you want a trained engine to work on your content, but if you have technical content, I'm wondering if there's any value to an untrained engine. I mean, are people are very hesitant with machine translation still, and especially in life sciences, but I'm wondering if it's good enough that even an untrained engine, would there be value to implementing that in your workflow? Or if it's still too risky?
Well, I mean, anyway, you cannot do that blindly, both. you cannot just, you cannot blindly use a stock engine, and you cannot just throw your content to any customizable system and then again just take it and use, because what we recommend doing first, you look how it works on your content, you understand before you go all in into production, you see how it works. And in many cases we use stock engines, but with some things on top to make them more appropriate. Because, for example, well, one case we had was related to that. Our customer in legal space, they had it's a large law firm. They had lots of bilingual documents translated in the past in some European languages, but it turned out that thanks to European Parliament and their corpora, which they published, actually many stock engines do pretty well on legal content in European languages. And then you just need to look at the stock engines. So what you see when you're looking at them, you realize that every MT system, they have, well, it's a little bit simplification, but it feels like a bit slider between fluency and fidelity, right? So that, and you cannot control that, but you just need to pick an engine which will not be too fluent on legal content, because otherwise it will be not translating legal text, but more like explaining it in layman terms, and that's not something you expect from machine translation. Like another example is that when you try to post edit and you evaluate performance, you will see that very often there are some specific issues which require most of the time to fix. And this may be with terminology, then yes, indeed you need to train. But this may be with other things, it may be with tone of voice, because when you translate from English to German or Spanish or Russian, almost any language, you have to be consistent in either formal or informal. And if you see that lots of effort goes there, then you can fix tone of voice, which can be done in different ways. Some engines support it natively, like DeepL or Naver. It can be done on top, which we do on our platform. And then you don't, without training, you get significant boosts of productivity, which may be 50%, just by fixing tone of voice. So, answer your question with, and another example is that in many domains, you just don't have training data. If it's live chat, it's hardly likely to have training data for colloquial content in chat. Then you have to use stock engines, again, with some light tuning on top. So absolutely, in many cases, across our customers and projects, we use stock engines. And also, if you have high volume translation, you go for stock engine just for the price, because if you need to translate several gigabytes per month, then suddenly difference between $6 and $100 per megabyte starts to be important, right?
Yeah.
Not for post editing. For post editing, you anyway will pay more to post editors. But if you just run documentation into 60 languages, maybe important.
Konstantin, how long does, in your estimation, when you're just starting out, as Nicole had said, training this engine, what's a time frame where you can get more comfortable with that it's fully trained to be able to produce the type of content that may be customer facing? What is that range of time? Is it content dependent or?
Well, typically, if we just look at numbers, it takes about 3-4 weeks. But it's hard to extrapolate here, because we're doing tech for last 3 years. We're building lots of tools to actually, and like our department, which does those MT curation services, they actually have a KPI, which is about how many hours goes into the project. and they have a goal to reduce it by building new software. So it's hard to say how much it will take without these tools, but currently we're about 3-4 weeks, and it's just technically, it's quite simple. Is that about 1 week you spend to clean the data, because you cannot go without cleaning the data, and then about 1 week you spend to train the engines, because they take time to train. Some engines may take several days to train. Then about 1 week, what you do some analysis to prepare data for reviewers. And you cannot do just random sampling, because there's a problem that you need human review, because there's lots of requirements which can be captured just by other subject matter experts or people who know the guidelines. But human review is expensive, so you need to have a little bit of content for review. And if you do random sampling, there's lots of outliers can get into this small sample, and then you'll have this very typical situation when you run different tests on NT and they all produce different results. So to avoid that, you need to do crunch some numbers and prepare very special content for reviewers. And then about 1 week it takes to get, after you got content from reviewers, to do analysis and figure out what to use. And on this last step also, what you probably want to do, you want to check for, there's lots of options to further customize machine translation after training. You can add a glossary, you can change tone of voice, do some other customizations. If you have content with tags, you can look at different ways to work with those tags. And you cannot do that on initial step, because you cannot do that for all, 10 engines you're comparing. So that typically after you selected the linguistically the best engine, you look for how you can further tune it to get even better quality in this specific use case you're working with. So it's hard to do less than in 4 weeks. I think it can be more depending on tools.
Thank you.
Skills. Yeah.
So I know that Nicole, let me just ask a quick question that Paula had, and I wonder if Victor or Jeff or Medhat have any questions. Please feel free. I know that Paula was wondering about what's the latest in. I know we're all looking for ways to estimate the quality that comes out of the engines, and I'm wondering if you've I know we've been to the same conferences. You might have been to some more recently. Have we seen anything in the marketplace that's getting there? Is Intento doing anything like that? What's your thinking on that, Konstantin?
Quality estimation is very broad and complex topic, right? And I think everyone is looking for this holy grail, to find something which will help to estimate quality a priori, right? Before people touched it. And although everyone says that it's to make translator work more productive, the truth is industry needs that to do quotes, right? So that you can quote cost of the project right away, like you do with translation memory, right? When you just run this matching, and then you have the number which you can rely on. Meaning, if you take this number, you have your risk is controlled. And that's actually a huge problem with machine translation. And this problem emerged when machine translation started to be really good. Because if machine translation gives you, from 15 to 25 performance improvement, you can just promise this discount. If it didn't work, okay, you have margins more than that, so you can sort of cover it. And now when you have machine translation engine, which gives 70% of content perfect, just doesn't require review, then you cannot promise this type of discount without your risk controlled. Otherwise, you can just, if it misses, then you're in red zone. That's what we need, I think, good tools for. But the problem is I haven't seen such tools. We played over last year. Machine translation quality estimation is a hot topic. We played with, I think, 5 different technologies. from vendors, and some we tried ourselves. And what we found more or less confirmed what you see in other public publications from companies like TransPerfect and others, that you can rely on quality estimation for specific cases. You can rely on it to identify most likely good translation or most likely bad translations, but it will be a very small percentage of your whole project. Because the most of the translation will be under this bell curve, like where it's not too good or too bad, it's something in the middle. And that's where this quality estimation scores on project level, they are not really correlated with the effort, what we found and what many other people found. Another way to use it, you can use it in production, like you may see in MSource, right, in real time, to suggest translator what to do with a segment. Is it most likely good or most likely bad, or they need to look? But the problem is, again, you cannot rely on that financially. You cannot commit and make a quote based on that. So it may help translator.
Yeah.
But I think it's a big question. Either it will be quite accurate, but then it will be very small amounts of segments, which you can rely where you can rely on this metric. Or if you increase the thresholds and you mark more segments as good, then it's a question what will be with the output quality, because it may happen that, like with bad translation memory, if you rely too much on exact matches on the bad translation memory, you get your output quality very low level.
Yeah.
So I would say it's still the holy grail. Sorry, it's our opinion.
Kind of like you got a couple different data points from different techniques to estimate the quality. You get these data points, and then you still rely on the extra data point of the human evaluation, and you evaluate the different data points and come up with an understanding at some point. But perhaps there will be, maybe Intento will invent the Holy Grail. Paula, do you have a follow-up question about?
Sorry, Lara, but I see that Jeff wanted to ask a question for a while. Let other people as well chip in.
Jeffy, did you have a question?
Oh yeah, I was just wondering what the industry average on AMT engine training cadence, or Konstantin, if you have a recommendation on how often we should be doing the engine training on. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
I would say it's if you speak about exactly training, meaning when you train it on your translation memory, so not glossary, not other sort of ways of customization, then when you have a significant increase of your training data, right? And it depends on the volumes. I would say that so there's a number of factors. One is volume of new data. And I would say rarely a company has enough data to update engines more than quarterly. So I would say it's a very rare case, because you need to clean this data, and cleaning typically filters 60 to 80%. Not because it's bad translations, just because it's not appropriate for training for whatever reason. You may have a placeholder there, or it may be a sentence fragment, and you just filter all those things. And then you see that you don't actually have that much data. Then another factor here is the technology changes, which may require more frequent, like additional retraining. Like for example, in the summer, Microsoft, or autumn maybe, I remember, Microsoft announced that they're moving this next generation technology from stock engines to custom engines. Now, if you had Microsoft engine back then, it was a good point to retrain it, just to leverage the new technology. So I would say that in practice, we see it from quarterly to annually, depending on the volumes. And you can do it less often than annually, probably, because what we see is after a year, just the underlying technology changes a lot. Sometimes even vendors like Google, they require you to update the engines, to retrain them every, I think, 18 months. In other cases, most likely if you retrain, if you update every year, you just get boosted because of the new technology. Well, you know, there are some engines which can be trained on every sentence. My impression, just from, I know a little bit how neural network works and training. My understanding that it's a little bit lighter approach to training. It's not that deep. So for such systems, it's something between actually translation memory and, you know, full empty training. And in such cases, it makes sense to update with every sentence. But it's a very, you may see that a little works this way, modern MT works this way, then Amazon Active Custom Translate, which was released end of last year. And I think Sistrun released new technology with this neurofuzzy matches. In those systems, it makes them, it makes sense to update with every sentence. But then there is one thing which relates to a question of which Paulo asked, because when you get this new sentence from post editor, how do you evaluate fully automatically that is good enough to be used for training? And it's a question which I don't have answer for, because I've seen many things coming from post editors just which may degrade performance of machine translation if you just use them for training.
Very good, very good.
So sorry for complex answers. Sorry for complex answers, but
we try to do the engine training every year or so. Obviously, you know, as you said, the volume of the work that we push through yearly basis or quarterly basis, it's a big factor. Obviously, with the budget as well, but we try to do it once a year. I just want to see how we are par with the industry average on that regard.
Yeah,
so thank you.
I think if you see that your data set increased like 10% at least, it makes sense to update. You can get boost from that. If it's less than 10% increase, then probably you shouldn't expect much.
An interesting metric.
Yeah.
We have Rachel have a question.
Hi. So my question is, at Pitney Bowes, you know, we talk about, you know, writing content to optimize machine translation. And, you know, we talk about it, we don't always succeed, but I mean, the thought process is there to write, you know, more concisely, to, you know, cut out, you know, the colloquialisms, all that stuff. And it's just kind of wondering how much difference, like in the quality of the MT that comes out, do you have an idea of how much difference that really makes than somebody just, you know, kind of writing the standard technical documentation, you know, without much thought to whether they said the same sentence exactly the same way every single time, kind of thing, and they wrote every sentence actively and consistently?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean that's a very important topic. And so we touch, I touch it in a number of places. So first, for example, when we evaluate machine translation engines, since we evaluate a number of them, it gives a unique possibility. You can pinpoint sentences, source sentences, which create problems for all MT engines, right? And because when you see all of them, you see where most of the problems come from. And that creates very important feedback for content authoring. And you can give feedback like, okay, if it's from French to English, in French, there's lots of ad hoc abbreviations used, especially in colloquial speech. And, or if it's medical domain, where doctors use lots of ad hoc abbreviations, like several thousand of them, if you just collect them all. And training don't really help here, because frequency of those words is so low that you can't really train on them. And glossaries don't help, because to apply a glossary, the translation need to understand this word in source. And if it's some made up word, doesn't understand it. So in this type of analysis, we clearly see that in certain domains, you have certain sentences which create issues for all MT engines. And it can be addressed by writing in a different way. I think we even published some sort of guidelines how to write for machine translation based on what we observed. And also I see it myself. We're a small company. We don't have actually, we don't have localization ourselves because we're too small, and we grow too fast for that because it creates certain friction. But we work with customers in Japan and China and Korea, and we work with them through machine translation. And when you write an email, which will be automatically translated, you know that, okay, I will use a very special way of writing things in English to avoid any sort of ambiguities and things like that. So absolutely. One of the things we're exploring right now, it's a special problem, is that when you work with colloquial content, you have many, you may have even typos. Also, you may have these colloquialisms. And we're exploring using technologies like GPT-3 for automated source quality improvement, so that you can take this sentence, and that's actually what this type of generative models works pretty good, do pretty good. You can ask it to rewrite sentence in more simple and more formal English, and then it's translated much better. I think I had a slide about that on webinar we made on GPT recently. So that's something to explore. So
I was wondering, Konstantin, do you have any kind of, I don't mean to put you on the spot, and if you don't, maybe we could collaborate with you to get something out there, but do you have any kind of white paper or anything that speaks about the best practices for content development for the best outcomes for machine translation?
Well, we have only simple blog posts about that. And I think that you're right, compared to an LSP, we definitely have less exposure to such content. So I think, yeah, it's been a very good place to cooperate, because really, it even, I think this example was brought by Georg from Dell at some conference, that one of the virtues of machine translation is also it's more consistent. And that's why actually you need less, you may need less guidelines to post editors, because translation is more consistent. It may be consistent in its own way, but still. And that also applies to working with source content. So you need to have source content consistent. And we see that it creates a challenge for enterprise who writes the content. This content can be created in different parts of the company. They didn't need to have it consistent, because they sort of relied in translation, they relied on human judgment. Because it's human translation, they have those guidelines, they will make translation consistent anyway. So machine translation cannot do that. And that's, you push a little bit of this effort to content writers, right? That this should happen, this must happen, I think.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know, Victor, if maybe you had any question?
Yes, we have already touched stock engines, and I have a question related to that. So as good quality stock engines are rising, this makes me think that let's say that I have trained an engine with custom data from our own material. And would I be better off if I used the stock engine instead, that is very fine-tuned and everything, and use all the glossary in it that I can. So put in all the glossary that I can. What do I lose and what do I win this way? What do you think?
Today, so about the glossaries, I think with a number of, with few exceptions, glossaries are implemented in a very simplistic way in machine translation. It's basically search and replace. So that's why it's good for product names. It's good for do not translate type of, like, for pronouns, do not translate lists. But if it's about terminology, which may have inflections and where you need to take care about morphology, glossaries will not help. There's a couple of exceptions, Systran and Yandex, I think.
And DeepL as well, I think. DeepL does that already.
Maybe, but they don't have it in the API, so for me it's hard to say. I haven't tested it.
I see.
So in other cases, it's mostly search and replace. So that's why you can't really rely on glossary to capture your, in-domain terminology. You have to train. It's more a question of maybe it's already captured. And there are two things. First, there are two different situations. One situation is when you have some new terminology, which is really specific to you. You prefer to use certain words, and that's the only thing you can do with training. Another example, another situation, is when it's widely used terminology, but it's used in your domain. Then what if you have context in your sentence, enough context so that machine translation engine may understand that it does from this domain, right? Then most likely stock engine will use this right terminology. The problem may be that you don't have enough context. If you have a training video for your retail company where a person says, I had a complex delivery yesterday. For machine translation engine, it's hard to distinguish furniture delivery and baby delivery, really hard in this case. And depending on the engine, in 50% it will be baby delivery. So in this case, you can either customize your engine so that even without this context, it knows that, okay, all deliveries is furniture. Another way, you can actually somehow add context to the sentence and then remove it. To do some sort of automated pre and post editing to supplement more content to the engine. And then some engines, stock engines, they can take into account neighbor sentences. I know two, I know DeepL and ModernMT. And in this case, you may have these short sentences without context, but if you translate bulk of them, the engine, again, stock engine, it will understand it's this domain and it will use the right terminology. So you see, it's not there's no easy solution.
Yes.
You need to understand what specific case you're dealing with. Is it like specific to your case? It's your terminology, or it's industry terminology. And then you either customize the engine or you find a way to in machine learning terms, it's called priming. You find a way to prime this model to use your terminology. By the way, sometimes there is middle ground. For example, we in some projects we do, I call it fake training. When, for example, Microsoft has a number of baseline models which are different in terminology, but there's no way to use them without training for some reason. But what you can do, you can pick some useless content, just useless corpora in this language, just general. And you can take one of those baseline models and sort of fake train it on this corpora. And then you have this baseline model, which is sort of stock, but it gives you right terminology. So it's something to consider.
It's a hack. It's a hack.
Basically.
Well, I mean,
Dominika, do you have a question?
Yes, I had one more question that was related to, perhaps you touched a little bit previously, Konstantin, on the tone of voice questions and how we can kind of fix them when we want to deploy MT for multilingual content and kind of address the tone of voice question beforehand, before it arises. So what about other AI biases like gender bias? Is there, I know that, you know, in the recent years, we've been talking about that a lot and companies care about it a lot right now. Is there a way to kind of anticipate that we might have a gender bias in our corpora?
you know, again, sorry for complex answer. There are two different situations. So one situation is classical bias. So classical bias means that in your text, you have, there is a right answer, but because of the data the model was trained on, you go not with the right answer, but with the biased answer. Like, for example, in your text, it's sort of clear from the text that she's a doctor, but because the doctor is biased to like masculine in all corpora, this gets translated in a wrong way. You get wrong translation because of this bias. And the only way to fight that is to work with your training data and to do testing of the model after training against those biases. But there's more in production, in a real setting. You must often, these cases for this bias you see in different data sets and benchmarks and challenges, but in reality, they do not occur that often. It's hard to, it's even hard to come up with such an example, like really, so that you will experience that. What you have in reality, you don't have context. You have a customer service conversation and somebody says, oh, I did this or I did that. And you know the gender, you know what tone of voice you need to use. But since it's a short sentence without context, a machine translation engine doesn't know that. And then it uses whatever induced by training data or whatever, but it's mostly just blind guessing. And this is something which can be addressed. And this is something which we're addressing like also on our platform. So like DeepL and Nether address tone of voice on their side. It's not that they debias something, but they give you control. They tell you, okay, if you know that it should be formal translation, please send us this parameter. We have it on our platform for all MT engines, like on the top, we have this type of processing. We see three most important cases. One is tone of voice, because when you translate from English and get mix of formal and informal in any language, it's super annoying.
Yes.
Then second is gender. And in many cases, again, in a real setting, you know, you have the metadata, you know the gender, or you know the, you know, what pronouns you should use in other languages where you have gender forms. And then you can just control it. And again, we have a way to control it. And one of the recent things is mood, is that if you read this book from English to Spanish, even that, I would say even the bias should be probably, if you have this sentence in colloquial setting, it's mostly imperative, right? It's clear that you're telling someone to read this book, but many engines would translate as indefinite. And you need to wait to also control this this type of grammatical mood. The source book can be fixed. So in one way, there's a way to fix that. In another way, it's not that bias which people typically talk about. So typically we talk about that there is this problem in data. And in practice, we see less of that. We see more this, how to control it. Not to debias, but control. And as you may know, in AI community, there's also no agreement around this bias thing, because essentially bias is what makes data set useful.
Mm-hmm.
If you remove all biases from a data set, domain bias, gender bias, tone bias, mood bias, you have no signal. It's useless data. It's more that you need to be very, very cautious about what bias you want to have in your data and what bias you don't want to have in your data.
Yeah.
And that's something which requires attention.
Fascinating. And yeah, I'm sure that we could nerd out about these topics for, the whole day, but I think it's slowly time to wrap it up.
Oh, sorry.
No,
No, don't be sorry. It was great.
Yeah.
It's very interesting. Thank you.
Yes.
So Domi?
Sure. So let me wrap it up. Thank you so much to our amazing audience for all your insightful questions today. Thank you, Konstantin, for joining us. It was really eye-opening, I think, for most of us. And just a quick note from our sponsor of All Things Global. So Vistatec is a global services provider that works with some of the world's most iconic brands to make multilingual versions of their products. We are known for our quality and for technical innovation. And we are also recognized for our academic focus. The All Things Global series aims to connect our global community with knowledge and ideas to support your successful international strategies. So if you need to know more, please reach out to Lara, Suzanne, myself, or any of your Vistatec contacts. And please join us for the next episode of All Things Global.
And I'd like to say a special thank you to Konstantin Savenkov, again, founder and CEO of Intento, which is an AI and MT curation company that enables global enterprise to successfully select and improve best fit machine translation and cognitive AI services. So if you have any questions or want further information, feel free to reach out to Konstantin or Mark Herpe, who couldn't join us today, who also is with Intento, to get your questions answered. And if you don't know how to get a hold of them on social media, let us know. We're happy to connect you and make introductions. Again, we'd like to thank everybody for attending this episode 4 of All Things Global, powered by Vistatec, and we'll see you next time. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Vistatec.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye, Konstantin.